The 1990s is my favorite decade ever, and I'm happy to be from this era that changes so much and caused a memorable impact for those who experienced this time. From the music scene, to the innovative movies, to the new rises for home computer and other technology, to the TV shows, and to the games that we've played during that era. Since I love the 1990s and video games so much, I've dedicated to start a video series exclusively on itstelltime.net, Gexup's Gaming in the 90s. Out of all the videos I have made, this new series is going to be totally different than what I've done in the past. This is how the series is going to work. In each episode of Gaming in the 90s, I'm going to pick a year from the 1990s starting from 1990 all the way to 1999. Each time I start a video based on that year, I'm going to try to remind everybody what was life like in that year, such as saying, this is the same year that The Lion King was released, to get you the basic idea of what this year is like. Throughout Gaming in the 90s, I'm going to be talking about the biggest game decisions made by video game developers during that year, like Sega released an ad campaign, Sega does what Nintendo don't, and then talk about my favorite games that came out that year on each gaming platform that was still at the market at the time, and other games that I also have to mention because it was either popular or revolutionary. So in the series, you're going to see the end of the NES era, the rise of Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, 3DO, TurboGrafx 16, Atari Jaguar, Neo Geo, and so many consoles and gaming platforms that once was in the market. I would like to address to everyone that I have not played all the games in the 90s. I have a life, you know. So that means if there's a game that was released that year that's not in this video, then that means it's either I haven't played it or I don't give a damn about it. I'm trying to keep these videos under 30 minutes, and it's impossible to talk about every single game on each year. But most of all, I'm only counting games that was released from that year in North America. There are going to be moments where I have to talk about a game that was first released in Japan, like in the 1980s, and North America didn't get it until somewhere in the 90s, like Super Mario Bros. 3 when we got it in 1990, and the release of the Super Nintendo when it was released in North America in 1991. I can't go through Japan and European releases because I'll be coming back and forth to the same games I've been talking about on the previous episode, and it will take me forever to get anywhere. In this series, I'm only counting North American releases only just to make everything simple. And finally, if there was a favorite year of mine in the 90s that has so many memorable things that came out that year, then I'll make a second video calling it Extras in the 90s. Like for example, when we get to 1991, then the extra video will be titled Extras in the 90s, 1991, where I go off topic about video games and talk about other great things that came out in that special year, like movies, albums, television shows, current events, and etc., just to remind my viewers why this year was good. I won't be doing a separate Extras in the 90s for every year, only my favorite years that has an everlasting appeal on me, personally. So in a nutshell, Gexup's Gaming in the 90s series, I'll be going through the consoles and handheld releases in North America, titles that revolutionized gaming, my favorite classics that people forgotten, the business decisions that the game companies like Sega, Nintendo, Sony, Atari, etc. have made in the 90s. The real reason why I'm doing this video series is because I'm a 90s kid. I'm from that decade. I find this decade so fascinating because the time era was so diverse and so varied that looking back at it now, made me appreciate it more and more. I can never forget this era of excitement and fun that I want to express myself about of being a gamer in that generation. So everyone, please join me as we take a trip back to the past in Gexup's Gaming in the 90s. The year was 1990, and if you take a very close look at this year, it's probably the only year in the 90s that didn't feel like the 90s, because we're still in the standards of the 80s with the hair, the fads, music, and etc. It's not like if we start a new decade, we automatically change to a new era. There has to be some kind of cultural impact that would instantly change our culture, and if you look at 2012 today, it's just the same lifestyle as it was in 2008. so technically 2012 isn't all that different since the day I started reviewing. But I digress. But just to get a better viewpoint of what 1990 was like, this was the year that the live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, Home Alone, Total Recall, and The Goodfellas was released in theaters. And this was also the same year that the Pixies' Bossa Nova, Megadeth's Rust in Peace, and Depeche Mode's Violators skyrocketed to the charts. So what was gaming like in the year 1990? Well, the year 1990 was like a seed starting to grow like a tree. Well, 1990 wasn't as provocative or as memorable as the later years of this decade, but it was a standard time and era that still has something to remember. Hell, the only thing I recognize about 1990 was that it's the year I was born, and the only thing that helps me to experience this time era was those baby videos that my parents made when I was born. In the mid-1980s, Nintendo has saved the gaming industry from the game market crash and started a golden era of gaming. But at the same time, it was a curse for Nintendo for saving the gaming industry because they have grown a lot of competitors trying to take down the Nintendo Entertainment System. Already the NES couldn't hold up any longer because other game systems has evolved to 16-bit, making better graphics, sound, frame rates, and gameplay variety that goes above the limitations from the 8-bit era. But regardless on how technically better the other consoles are, or were, which I'm gonna get into later in this video, the NES was still relevant, and millions of people around the world are still anticipated for games just for that system coming out in that year. Let's start with Mega Man 3. Mega Man 2 blew every gamer's minds away with the action, thrill, challenge, and other improvements over the original Mega Man. And it is expected to have Mega Man 3 in every Mega Man fan's buy list. The gameplay was just like Mega Man 2, but it was a brand new experience because of the new variety of robot masters that you have to choose to go after in their own world to explore and finally battle them. In Mega Man 3, you have Spark Man, Snake Man, Needle Man, Hard Man, Gemini Man, Magnet Man, Shadow Man, and Top Man, and once you defeat 8 of them, once again you have to go through the final stage and battle Dr. Wily. Once you fight and defeat any of the bosses you choose, your reward is once again to obtain the power where you can use them against enemies in other levels and make it easier to fight against the next boss. But my advice for those who want to make everything simple, defeat Top Man first because he has the best power in the whole game. One of the biggest entries in Mega Man 3 was the introduction of Proto Man. He was a great adversary for Mega Man that only shows up in half of the level, but later in the series he became Mega Man's best ally. Mega Man 3 was also famous for introducing the helpful Mega Slide and the most helpful sidekick, or pet, Rush. Rush is extremely useful because you can use him for flying, reaching to long distances, going inside him to travel underwater like a submarine, and other tools that provides great help once you summon him. Anyone saying that Mega Man 3 is just another installment of the Mega Man series couldn't be any more wrong. This was a huge and varied improvement for the series, and it's one game that should not be ignored. The second, and probably the best NES game of all time, was released in 1990, and to hype everything up with such anticipation in North America, people had to sit through the Fred Savage movie, The Wizard, to finally see a preview of the very game that is
Super Mario Brothers 3!
Super Mario Bros. 3. This game was released in Japan in 1988, and we Americans, who were at the other side of the world, didn't know anything about the game's existence, unless you lived in Japan in 1988. After watching the Wizard movie, gamers were going nuts over it, and with that anticipation, Super Mario Bros. 3 not only delivered, but Nintendo has given us so much more out of expectation. Just look at this classic. There were secrets everywhere in this game, and if you just go through every level from point A to B, you're really missing out on a lot of stuff. But what I especially love about this game is that it didn't start out saving the princess automatically, but instead help and rescue 7 different kings from 7 different worlds, and each and every one of those worlds have probably one of the best variety of level designs that you can ever find in the NES library. You can collect items and power-ups to enhance the gameplay, and man, does it ever with Super Mario Bros. 3, like the raccoon tail to make Mario fly in the air when he jumps at top speed, the frog suit that makes him jump twice as high, and even the bear that turned into a stone. Heck, even World 4, where everything was giant, is an automatic buy for me. I can't imagine anyone who likes platformers to miss out Super Mario Bros. 3 because to this day, People still love Super Mario Bros. 3 and consider it as one of the best games of all time. And for a game that originally came out in Japan in 1988 and in North America in 1990 and still entertains the hell out of players everywhere, deserves to be called one of the greatest games of all time. Other great titles that also came out in 1990 for the Nintendo Entertainment System is Dr. Mario, where it's heavily inspired by the phenomenon known as Tetris, but instead of using blocks to eliminate the rest of the blocks, Paper Mario instead uses pills, and Dr. Mario focuses on eliminating the viruses and playing the field by aligning them with pills of the matching color. And to add even more frustrating games for the Nintendo Entertainment System's library, we also have Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, and Ninja Gaiden 2, The Dark Sword of Chaos. But another big title that later on became one of the biggest franchises in video game history is the original Final Fantasy. This game originally came out in Japan in 1987, but we didn't get this game until 1990. The reason why this game was entitled Final Fantasy was because this was supposed to be Squaresoft's last game because they were in a financial crisis. But amazingly, this game sold well enough to actually keep the company going, and in fact, this title was so successful that Square to this day loves to milk out the Final Fantasy title and popularize role-playing games around the world. Well, I guess that's all I want to say about the great titles that came out in 1990 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Well, back in 1990, even though the NES was still in the market, there were also other consoles that were competing against Nintendo. Nintendo could still hold up against its competitors with the memorable series exclusively on that system, but the biggest advantage that other consoles had against the Nintendo Entertainment System is that the new consoles that they were providing were all 16-bit. Providing better graphics, sounds, and even frame rates to make the gaming experience a lot better than before. And who can ever forget about Nintendo's biggest rival, Sega? In 1989, they released the third gaming console, calling it the Sega Mega Drive.
What?
The Sega Mega Drive!
What?
You don't know the Sega Mega Drive?
Well, Sega made Sega SG-1000, Sega Master System, Sega Genesis.
Oh, I forgot. In North America, it was called the Sega Genesis.
Oh, that console.
Yes, that console. At the time, North America called it the Mega Drive, and later renamed it as the Genesis to make it more appealing. At the time, Sega went brutal against Nintendo with their ad campaign,
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
What Nintendo?
This brought a whole new level of competition in video games that we gamers like to use the term quote-unquote console war. And Sega's ad campaign on Genesis Does What Nintendo brought a new level of not only competition of the company against Nintendo, but also gamers against gamers. You know, the term that we like to use nowadays called fanboy wars. Whatever console you own at home is your side of the army, and these new gamers began fighting each other about which system is better than the other. Let me put this in perspective, everybody. This is not just any ordinary competition. This is the competition in the gaming industry. This is like Burger King versus McDonald's. This is like Tupac versus Big. This is Red Sox versus Yankees. This is Disney versus Warner Brothers. This is Sega versus Nintendo, bitch! Oh boy, I'm getting carried away. While Nintendo had the familiar titles on their system, what Sega had over Nintendo back in 1990 was that they had the best variety of sports games and celebrity names to appeal to the older audience. Back then, Nintendo was starting to be considered to be a kiddie console, but older gamers got the appeal from Sega saying that all these sports games and famous names are all for you. But just to let you know that I am not going to go through sports games because, really, it's a big waste of time. I mean, what's so special about sports games with a roster of athletes that are just so forgettable? So if you're expecting me to talk about sports games in Gexup's gaming in the 90s, well, that's going to hog up all the space in gaming in the 90s, so I have to go over more important games other than sports games. But back on the best games on the Sega Genesis released in 1990. This was before Sega had their own #1 mascot, which is what we're going to get into on the next episode of Gaming in the 90s, but there were big names like the most popular pop star in the 1980s. So who was the biggest pop star in the 1980s? Well, Michael Jackson. And Sega has made a game based on Michael Jackson's movie, Moonwalker. This was 2 years after the movie was released, but MJ wasn't through hyping up the movie, so he got Sega to release his game based off of his movie. Originally, Moonwalker was released in the arcades as an isometric view beat-em-up, but porting Moonwalker on the Genesis was a completely different experience because it's a side-scrolling beat-em-up action platformer, and it was huge back in 1990. You can see him attack like a smooth criminal, no pun intended, rescue children, and dance just like in the movie. This was a very fun game on the Genesis, even though the haters love to make fun of this game, but it sold incredibly well that it put Sega on the map. So if you're a Sega fan, you have to thank Michael Jackson for giving the company the license and give Sega a chance against Nintendo. Even though that there were a lot of games on the Genesis that appealed to the older audience, there were plenty of games for all ages. Other great titles for the Sega Genesis that came out in 1990 was Castle of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse. When I was little, I never did want to play this game because looking at the cover, it freaked me out. But I was too young to learn that you shouldn't judge games by its cover. This is one of the best Disney games on the Sega Genesis, but of course there were better ones that came out later. It didn't get the same appeal as to other games like Super Mario Bros. 3, but it did spawn plenty of creativity and quality of gameplay challenge. People may not remember this, but this was actually one of, if not the first Disney games that ever was in 16 bits. Well, what can I say? It's a unique hop and bop platformer that has a lot of unique levels. But hands down, the best Sega Genesis game that came out in 1990 is Capcom's Strider. Now, to even prove what Sega does what Nintendo don't, allow me to demonstrate. This is the arcade version of Strider. This is the Sega port of Strider. And this is the NES port of Strider. Okay everybody, case closed. The release of Strider in the arcades was a whole new era for Capcom because it gave them the privilege to make more arcade games, and console gamers at home always wanted to play Strider in their living rooms, and the best choice to play this game at home was none other than the Sega Genesis, which was the near version of the arcade version. This game was a really great action-packed platformer where you play as Strider, where you can wield a sword that can reach 5 feet away from you and cause massive damage on anyone who opposes you. Really, this is one of the best games on the Genesis, and there's nothing much to say about this game other than what you see is what you get. And what you're seeing is awesome, and what you're going to get, if you haven't played it yet, is awesome. And I'm telling you, Strider is still loved by hardcore Capcom and Genesis fans. But even though 1990 was a new era of this console war, the main focus was Sega versus Nintendo. But there were still other systems that were still great on the market. We still had the Game Boy, but we also had the TurboGrafx 16, or the TurboGrafx 16 Entertainment Super System. This is perhaps one of the most forgotten consoles ever because really, this is the first 16-bit console, and it was developed by none other than Hudson Soft. You know, the company that made Bomberman. In Japan, it was called the PC Engine, but really, PCs have gotten better, and keeping the name the PC Engine would be embarrassing for being obsolete in the later years. But regardless, if you know the TurboGrafx 16 before watching this video, you deserve a pat on the back for calling yourself a real gamer. The TurboGrafx 16 is one of my favorite consoles because it was none other than 16-bit fun. And owning one back in 1990 was a great time for the TurboGrafx 16 owners. But unfortunately, not that many people in North America paid a lot of attention to the TurboGrafx 16, which later made Hudson Soft to not make any more consoles. Well, back in 1990, Hudson Soft had a mascot for the TurboGrafx 16, and no, it was not Bomberman. But instead, it was Bunk the Caveman, with his game, Bunk's Adventure. What's unique about the gameplay in Bunk's Adventure is that it's a side-scrolling platformer where Bunk attacks enemies by bonking them with his large invincible forehead. Bunk starts out with the game with 3 hearts worth of health, which are depleted to blue as Bunk takes damage. Bunk's health can be restored by increments by collecting fruits and vegetables. He can also collect meats as power-ups, which lend him to special abilities and make him stronger. But the unique thing about Bunk is that this platformer is set in the Stone Age where there were dinosaurs and weird lizard creatures everywhere. And back in the 90s, dinosaurs were very popular with children, and heck, I was one of them who absolutely loved dinosaurs. I could really see the appeal of Bunk the Caveman, but it wasn't enough to get anyone's attention, no matter how badly the TurboGrafx 16 hype up the series. Well, let's name some other titles for the system that came out in 1990, with one of the most popular titles just for that system, Legendary Axe 2. This is a wonderful action platformer where the king and queen of a royal kingdom die and their 2 sons have to fight each other for the throne, and you play as the good son who lost to his evil brother, and it's up to you to inherit back the throne. You have 4 weapons to choose from: the sword, the axe, the sickle chain, and the smart bomb. There are 7 levels in this game, and at the end of each level, there is a boss. If you can overlook at this topless character that you play as, then you can see that this game is really action-packed and worthy enough to be in anyone's TurboGrafx-16 collection. But wait, it gets better. The TurboGrafx-16 also had a classic horror game called Splatterhouse. This was the time where video games weren't familiar with horror games, and Splatterhouse was one of the first games that done it right with its atmosphere, gameplay, and design that really scared many gamers who played this game. Originally, this game came out in 1988 in the arcades, but playing this game late at night with the TurboGrafx-16 was the perfect fit to witness its nightmares. It's so eerie and so violent that I'm surprised that this game didn't have that much controversy when it was first released. Yeah, it's kind of a bummer that they heavily censored the North American version. There's only one attack to do, and all you're doing is following a very linear path, but you have to admire the fact that the developers that were working on this game put a lot of thought in creating a very unique horror game. But wait, it gets better! If you're a fan of strategy games like Advance Wars, you're definitely in for a treat for a game called Military Madness. To my surprise, this game was released in 1990, and it came 11 years before Advance War was released. Talk about a game that was ahead of its time. Military Madness was made way before strategy games were recognized. Military Madness was a turn-based strategy game that uses a hexagonal map on an overhead view, and it's up to you to use your arms to move them to an empty hexagon to go up against the opposing team. Once you got your troops to reach to an enemy fleet, or the other way around, you get yourself a cutscene of that event of battle. It requires battle plans, tactics, and more to defeat your enemies in each stage. I only recommend this game if you're a fan of strategy games, but be warned that you have to learn a lot from it, because if you think that you can beat every level by rushing in, you'll be in for a shock to see how the opposing team is smarter than that. Although no other console can go up against Sega and Nintendo, because really, in North America, the gaming industry at the time was just loving to see these two companies to see who's going to make it to the top. And let's be honest, it's been that way throughout the 90s. But there was one brand new gaming system that has already been released in 1990 worldwide, and that is SNK's Neo Geo. Out of all the consoles that had the best hardware up to this point, it has to be the Neo Geo, because this system was built for the arcade cabinets made by SNK, specifically the Neo Geo MVS. But the main highlight is that the Neo Geo had a great usage of 2D animation up to that point in gaming, and it was the only system that had the perfect port from the original arcade machines, minus some of the frame rate issues. As amazing as the system was, the only problem with the Neo Geo is the price of the system. Just for the system alone costed $650 US American dollars, and that is more expensive than just buying the NES and the Genesis together. And toss that with games that come as low as $50, and a game cartridge that can go up to $300. Games that cost $300? SNK must have been really thinking that there were going to be a lot of kids who can afford their games at that price. And for that reason alone, the Neo Geo could never approach Sega or Nintendo in being the #1 spot. But regardless of what I have to say, there are some games that I actually like from the Neo Geo, but I can only have time to name one that came out in 1990, and that is Magician Lord. Now, if there was one reason why the Neo Geo was a good system, it has to be because of Magician Lord. Really, at the time, 16-bit graphics were getting better and better, and Magician Lord showed how much potential that this game had. If you were interested in games like Strider or Legendary Axe 2, I recommend Magician Lord more, because each level you go through is very lengthy, the enemy variety is so imaginative, the action is top-notch, and the highlight of the game is always the transformation, where you can find a power-up and use them against stronger enemies. This platformer is so wild and so unique that I just loved it so much. You know, it's pretty funny that I started this series talking about console gaming only, but we should never forget about PC gaming. Yes, there were home computers back in 1990. In fact, in the mid-1980s, home computers started to rise in the gaming market in the crash of 1983. But personal computers back in 1990 didn't have the internet, they didn't have CD-ROMs, or social networking. Home computers were great tools for work, but most of all, they were a great platform for gaming. We had the Amiga, DOS, Mac, and etc. Home computers got more and more popular, and the biggest selling point for computer games were adventure games. And really, the best adventure game that came out in 1990 was The Secret of Monkey Island. Now, this was not LucasArts' first adventure game, but it's fortunately one of their best and most memorable. This is a very well constructed game for its puzzle solving, but the hilarious characters and situations that has a movie-like presentation to feel like it was more like a comedy film. It took that piratey adventure in a unique level that is so irresistible to let go from its charm. Playing as Guybrush Threepwood and to see him travel his adventure trying to be a pirate and discover Monkey Island was none other than enjoyable each time I played this classic. I did a review on this game with Hunter the Hun Mackinnon, and it's something that I'm proud of doing. This game is so enjoyable in so many levels that people who aren't familiar with adventure games still recognize as Monkey Island. But I still have one more room to talk about one of the best PC classics that came out this year. And this game is the groundbreaking Wing Commander. The creator of the series, Chris Roberts, wanted was a space flight simulator with a good mix of interactive soap opera storyline. Wing Commander was a huge technical achievement for interactivity in general because it controls way better than your average space flight simulator. It's one of the first games where you can fully customize your ship and uses those upgrades against your enemies, but most impressively, the cockpitted performance affected gameplay. Going above and beyond, the Call of Duty resulted in medals, promotion and rank were rewarded at regular intervals, and success or failure in certain critical missions that would even decide the player's plot progress. If you haven't played this game yet, you owe it to yourself to try out one of the pioneers of interactive soap operas that went above and beyond all the games that came out in the early 90s. And finally, the last great PC game that came out in 1990 is The Terminator for DOS. This is, in my opinion, the very first sandbox game before DMA design was created. You play as the Terminator sent back in the 1980s, and you have a list of characters to assassinate. You have stores to buy and steal, vehicles to hijack, and even pedestrians to kill. Terminator for DOS was a huge achievement for gaming in a non-linear world, which soon opened doors to this new game subgenre called sandbox games coming out of the following year. Entering the 90s was a huge year with great releases of movies, music, comic books, and especially games. But trust me as I say this is just 1990, and the later episodes of the series will get better. Our next episode in Gexup's Gaming in the 90s is 1991. Shit. This is a year that is so big that it's going to be even longer than this episode of Gaming in the 90s. And let me remind everybody that 1991 is a big year, and if this video got you interested in the series, please stay tuned for more of Gexup's Gaming in the 90s, because like I said earlier, the year 1990 was just a seed grow into a tree, and let's just see how fast it will grow from here on out. While we're still feeling nostalgic, this is Gexup saying,
Yo DJ, spin that wheel, spin that wheel, spin that wheel, I'ma make you feel, yo DJ,